Welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for Friday, April 14th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other useful knowledge related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you Ryan Kolker of the International Code Council. Ryan spoke about off-site construction, where people build homes and other buildings in a factory, and then transport the mostly complete buildings to their final location. The slides and video for Ryan's talk are available at ICLR's website, www.iclr.org/workshops. Next time, on Friday, May 12th, Janelle Maffei and Cheryl Rabinovici of the California Earthquake Authority, which is the state's earthquake insurer for homes, will tell us about why and how people should seismically retrofit older wood frame houses, which is relevant to Lower BC and Montreal. Today's speaker is ICLR's Director of Partnerships, Sophie Guilbault. She'll present case studies from our Cities Adapt program about how communities are improving flood resilience of municipal infrastructure to ensure their long-term durability and performance. Flood losses cost Canada at least $700 million per year, some of which could be reduced with better flood control and other resilience measures. Sophie will tell us how some proactive cities are doing that. Cities Adapt is one of ICLR's flagship themes. Sophie's been working for 10 years with Canadian municipalities on the Cities Adapt program. Its goal is to promote adaptation best practices to extreme weather events. And for those of you who don't already know Sophie, her background is in architecture and emergency management. She's joining us today from Lyon, France, where she's temporarily relocated until September of 2024. Now, our agenda. Before our speaker begins, here's what we're going to do. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for about half that time. Then I will moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. So that means that if we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speaker's slides and a link to the video today or Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who could not attend, let them know. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Sophie. Sophie, take it away.
Thank you very much, Keith, for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about one of our main programs that I've been managing, as Keith mentions, for many years now. So I'm going to start by briefly introduce you to what the Cities Adapt program is, and then I'm going to go straight in and talk about some of the recent case studies. I have 9 case studies that I've featured for today's presentation from our latest publication in this series of reports. So, excuse me. Celebrating local leadership. Why did we start Cities Adapt in the first place? So as you all know, ICLR has been doing research for 25 years now, looking at making recommendations on best adaptation practices at the home level, at the community level. And so 10 years ago, we thought it was time to start celebrating what are some of those good actions, creative and strong initiatives that have been taken by communities across the country to celebrate all the good things that were happening, and also to create a network of communities that we can learn from and that communities can exchange between them to learn about what are some of those practices. So let's say Moncton is facing a similar issue as Victoria, BC. Then they have, examples of what was successful in one community, and they can, learn from all these practices that others have learned from. So the first report was published back in 2014, and we are now working on the 6th volume, which we think will be published in Q4 2023 on green infrastructure. And our previous publications were looking at municipal initiatives to reduce the risk of damage from flood, wildfires, severe wind, and other hazards. So I have the five first publications here. Volume 1 on extreme rainfall, Volume 2 in partnership with Health Canada on extreme heat with a heat health perspective, Volume 3 on extreme weather in general, covering all types of different hazards, the fourth looking at severe wildfires, and finally the one that we're gonna dive in today, looking at climate resilient infrastructure. So why did we choose this theme? As you saw, we're previously focusing on specific hazard, but we know that each year municipal buildings across the country, whether they are transportation systems, water supply, wastewater treatment plants, and roads, bridges, are affected by severe weather events in communities across the country. Most public infrastructure in Canada was designed many years ago using construction and standards that are different from today and that were historically based on the climate data that had been collected previously and not necessarily looking at future projected climate conditions. We know that nearly 60%, that's according to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, of public infrastructure in Canada is built and maintained by municipality. So which links to the big role that communities have to play. And the increased risk faced by these infrastructure has several municipalities considering the future resilience of their infrastructure when faced with either rehabilitating or building new assets or new systems. I want to share some numbers. One of the things we try to do with the Cities Adapt report is that each book has 20 communities, and we try to include representations from communities across many provinces and territories, including Indigenous communities. We try to represent small and large communities. And so in this specific report, we covered 8 provinces, 2 territories, including 2 Indigenous communities. We have communities that vary in size from 120 inhabitants to nearly 3 million. We have 9 different types of public infrastructure that are covered, including roads, water reservoirs, various drainage and stormwater infrastructure. We cover mostly adaptation to flood, but we also touch on erosion, drought, storm surge, and landslides as well. Our latest reports in the series, we really link them to the Sendai priorities for action, and we've noticed that each of the case studies, they were maybe stronger in one element, so we organized them alongside the priorities of action, which are understanding risk, with the idea that disaster risk management should be based on understanding first the risk. What are the dimensions of vulnerability? What is the exposure? What type of hazard we may face in a specific area? So to really start with that, to be able to take the appropriate adaptation action after. Another big element, very true for all the municipalities that we covered, is about having a strong disaster risk governance in place. So that can mean obviously at the national, regional, global level, but at the community level. And we've seen also a lot of partnerships in between different levels of government. So disaster risk government has been a key pillar. The third one is investing in disaster risk reduction. So we have seen through these case studies that there's a lot of public and private investments that need to be done to achieve big projects, especially true in this volume on public infrastructure. A lot of these measures come with a high cost. So we've seen many examples of communities that have reached out to provinces or other sorts of grants to be able to achieve the desired outcomes. And another one, and we've seen this in all 5 reports, is that recovery is an important opportunity to build back differently, to build back stronger opportunities, to take the time to pause and really think about how we can, build back better and include climate resiliency into the rehabilitation of the infrastructure. So I'm going to start by presenting some of the cases that we include in the understanding risk category. The first one brings us all the way north to the Northwest Territory in the community of Norman Wells. So we know that their climate change does not only affect obviously the municipalities in Canada's south, but there are different types of changes happening in Canada's north. And those changes are threatening the integrity of community infrastructure, including, in this case, roads and drainage infrastructure. So the town of Normanville specifically is located on the shores of the Mackenzie River. And over time, community members and the local government started noticing that the rate of erosion was increasing on the riverbank, which was threatening the stability of local roads and other infrastructure as well. So they reached out to consultants. Excuse me. They reached out to consultants to identify what are the processes that are affecting the riverbank. And the study reported that thaw settlement of roadways as a result of permafrost degradation could impact road infrastructure, more specifically as it relates to land drainage, ditches, and culverts. Also, they looked at slope stability of the riverbank and identified some key areas of concern that were faced with greater erosion. And the report noted that surface runoff erosion was observed at several locations along the studied area caused by inadequate drainage. So the report that came out of this study, and I should have mentioned before, but each case study in all report, we separate in 5 sections. So we look at the science, what's happening in the background, what was the trigger for the town to take action, what's the approach they followed, what's the outcome, and then, and you'll see that on the next slide, we let the community say a word about what they learned, what would they do differently, and things like that. So in this case, the report that came out of the geotechnical investigation of the riverbank was very well received by the town's council, and they approved as a first step the development and implementation of a comprehensive drainage plan to reduce erosion and flooding risk along 7 kilometers of the Mackenzie River, which was directly next to the road that was at risk. So the study conducted by Stantec also allowed the community to better understand the risk that were faced by the Mackenzie River, the road bordering the river, and some of the actions that not only need to take in this first step, but that will need to be happening over time to ensure that the road lasts a long time. So when we spoke with Kathy Clark, who's the Senior Administrative Officer for the town of Norman Wells, she told us that as northern communities are facing the impact of climate change, it is instrumental to not only inform, but to educate community members of the risk faced by local infrastructure and the need to implement adaptation actions in the future so they don't come as a surprise. Oops, sorry. Now, moving back a little bit further southeast, we have the city of Laval in Quebec, which is on the north shore of Montreal. We have a lot of case studies in this book of communities that use the PIVC protocol, which stands, for those who may not know of it, for the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee. This is a protocol that was developed by Engineers Canada to help communities, for example, better understand the risk or the vulnerabilities faced by their infrastructure, and to better understand what are some of the actions that could be taken to reduce these vulnerabilities to specific climate risks. So that protocol was created in 2005 to allow for engineering assessment of the vulnerability of Canada's public infrastructure. And in 2011, the city of Laval was amongst the early adopters of the protocol, and they used this approach to, they choose to use it on the Belgrand overflow structure, which was part of one of their big basin. So the city of Laval partnered with external partners such as Uranos and a consulting firm, and they recruited the right stakeholders from various municipal departments to understand the infrastructure as a whole. So with the PIVC protocol, you regroup all stakeholders that are somehow involved with the infrastructure to really gather all the necessary around the table, and through a series of workshops, you can identify what are some of the key risks faced by the infrastructure. And so one of the key findings of the study was the necessity to design new structures within the Belgrand overflow structure catchment area that would promote stormwater management at the source and reduce some of the pressure faced by the structure. And so what happened specifically in Laval, which was interesting, is that at the time, there was no funding assigned in the city's master plan to undertake some of the recommended actions to reduce some of the vulnerabilities and the risk faced by the structure. But fast forward several years later, there was an opportunity that came up where to apply for a grant for specific type of adaptation project. That was really what the city was looking at. They needed background studies to show what the risk was, to show that they understood the proposed remediation action. And so the city of Laval at that point, several years later, was ready to go. And they were granted nearly $500,000 to build a pilot project of stormwater infiltration features built alongside municipal sidewalks within 2 different areas of the catchment. So when I spoke with Martine Galarneau, who's an engineer with the city of Laval, she told us that the protocol allowed them to highlight specific risks and vulnerabilities that may have otherwise been missed without the multidisciplinary approach that was used. Larger municipalities have a tendency to work in silos within individual departments, and the approach promoted by the protocol allowed them to foster strong collaboration between various groups. The work they undertook allowed us to understand the specific challenge faced by the Belgrand overflow structure and enable their municipality to start planning for future projects and act quickly when capital funding became available. All right, staying in Quebec for this next one, we're moving to the municipality of Victoriaville for a reservoir restoration project. So municipalities around the country, they rely on reservoirs for potable water, and more frequent floods and droughts can reduce the reliability of the reservoir's water supply. So the amount of water available in reservoirs can also be impacted by sediment accumulation, which can worsen under increased erosion condition upstream. Specifically in Victoriaville, the city first started looking into the causes that they were noticing some water losses into their reservoir over 20 years ago, and they studied it over time. I think it was over 10 years. And the initial studies revealed that one of the main issues was the high amount of sediments that were gradually filling the basin at a rate of approximately 16,000 cubic meters per year. And so when that happens, obviously there's less deep level of water, which causes for the water temperature to increase, which can cause for the proliferation of a certain type of bacteria. It just creates a whole lot of risk for the community. So city staff from various departments, consultants, and representatives from several provincial ministries started looking simultaneously into actions that could be taken both upstream and downstreams in the reservoir itself. And they came up with the conclusion that for optimal results, they would do an initial dredge of the reservoir and followed by recurrent dredging over time to provide the best outcome for the community. So dredging is the excavation of sediments. And another interesting that they did is that all these sediments that they would collect over time, they used them to fill a big hole close to the reservoir that was eventually used and transformed as a community space. So they did not waste any of what was collected. So the initial dredge, as well as the construction process for the separate water reservoir and sediment dewatering plant, because they had to build that as well, in the spring of 2021, and construction was expected to be completed last year. So the dredging process will be conducting over an 11-week period annually for the next 5 years, followed by maintenance dredging beginning in 2028. Oops, sorry. When we spoke with Joël Lambert, Associate Director of Engineering and Environment Services for the city, he mentioned that it is important to work as a team, both internally and externally, to make sure that all departments and stakeholders are aligned on desired outcomes and deliverables. They found that it was important in Victoriaville to build on a unifying goal that brought benefits to all parties involved. And while it took a long time to get a comprehensive understanding of the situation that they were dealing with and identifying the right adaptation solution for the community, it was key to do so to ensure public funds were invested in a way that would serve the population in the long run. All right, so now moving to some of the disaster risk governance case studies that we identified. Moving to Ontario, in Toronto, some of you may remember back in 2005, there's the Finch Avenue culvert that collapse, which was caused by an extreme rainfall event in August 2005 that brought a significant amount of rain over a short period of time. The existing, at the time, corrugated steel culvert was undermined by water and debris accumulating behind it. Debris from upstream, stretch of Black Creek gathered downstream and blocked the culvert, resulting in a buildup pressure and its eventual breach and collapse. In terms of the approach, the City of Toronto prioritized resiliency in the new culvert design and conducted research to determine best practices. They also changed their design standard, not only for this culvert, but for the other ones to come, to reflect 100-year storm events as opposed to the 50-year storm events that they were formerly using. The Finch Avenue culvert collapse and subsequent reconstruction, as I mentioned before, brought some light to some deficiencies within the city's design process and management and inspired some changes. So as I mentioned, they are all now based on the 100-year storm event. And additionally, a new inspection process is now in place after each major rainfall event, where operations and maintenance personnel are dispatched to all the major culverts after an extreme rainfall event to inspect and identify any deficiencies requiring immediate attention. And this was one of the strong case studies, and we've seen in other communities as well that part of it, if you want to increase climate resiliency, is about really the infrastructure itself. But a very important part is also about the maintenance, the asset management plan, and how you plan to, keep it in good shape over time. When we spoke with Nazareno Capano, who is the manager of transportation policy and innovation in the transportation services of the city, he mentioned that he would suggest undertaking climate change vulnerability assessments for major pieces of infrastructure, as it will help identify potential risks and guide the development of programs and procedures to mitigate the future impacts of climate change. It is crucial to put in place whatever is needed now to prevent adverse impacts of climate change in the future by first establishing where the priority is and by working with local conservation authorities for support. The next case study brings us to Montreal, a slightly different type of infrastructure, to give you an overview of what's to come in our next report. And it's about rethinking urban parks to mitigate flood risks. So this is an urban flooding adaptation measure. Like it is the case in many communities around the country, combined sewer systems have conventionally been used as the primary system to collect and transport rainwater during rainfall events. However, we've seen more and more over the last year that during extreme rainfall events, they easily get overwhelmed, which results in many cases of urban flooding, basement floodings across communities. And so as a result, there's many cities in Canada and elsewhere that have started using land use planning tools as a way to naturally increase the absorption of rainwater into the ground, and mostly as a way to delay its transportation to the sewer system so that it is not as overwhelmed during peak rainfall, during peak precipitations. So the city of Montreal has faced several of those extreme rainfall events in recent years, which has resulted in many urban flooding incidents in numerous areas of the community. And one particularly devastating event occurred in May 2012 and resulted in over 5,000 basement flooding claims. So this specific project happened when a very densely built area of the city was about to be redeveloped. And so as the city was starting to think about drainage, they at the same time started drinking about how they could use this big public park that was centrally located in the area as a way to reduce the pressure on traditional gray infrastructure. So they started planning the new Pierre Dansereau Park as an opportunity to incorporate green infrastructure to collect rainwater and delay its transportation. So the team planned the park with integration of natural features, like you can see on the picture, a lot of different elevations to collect water. And I believe the total was that they can collect an additional 627 cubic meters of rainfall that can be stored there and slowly, whether it is absorbed or sent later to the sewer system. So the intervention, excuse me, designed by the City of Montreal's team for the entire neighborhood, includes now a total of 3 parks with stormwater ponds, 1 rain garden, and only 1 underground basin. Building new stormwater infrastructure independently from the construction of the park would have been more expensive for the municipality. They also found that this type of features integrated in the park created some very interesting areas for the communities. They found that some areas that were purely aimed at stormwater collections are now some of the main areas where kids love to play with rocks, play with the vegetation. Some plants grew there, some berries as well. And so they are amongst the most popular areas of the park when dry, obviously. When we spoke, oops, I'm sorry, this is the wrong quote, but when we spoke with the City of Montreal, they did mention that the system was replicated in many other parks of the city, and that it is now one of the key strategies used by the city, and that many parks are looking at more intersectoral collaborations within the city with urbanism and parks and several departments to make sure that these integrated projects can be replicated more often. Now, moving on to investing in disaster risk reduction. So we're going back all the way up north. So we have the community of Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories, all the way north. In the north, road raising may be part of an adaptation and resiliency strategy in response to sea level rise, coastal flooding, coastal erosion for communities that are living on Canada's coast. Warmer temperatures in Tuktoyaktuk have led to doubling in the frequency of summer storms during open water season, from 1 to 2 per summer to 3 to 4, combined with a change in the level of storm surge from 1.7 to 1.9 meter. This has led to increased erosion, and following a risk modeling study, funding became available from the government of the Northwest Territories through the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund to actually execute the road raising project in Tuktoyaktuk. So the hamlet held several community consultations when this project started to discuss and explain the results of the erosion modeling study and how its recommendations would be applied. This was partly done because in addition to the road raising project, more than 15 houses that were deemed to be at high risk had to be moved in response to the erosion of the shoreline. So the outcome is that the road raising project is ongoing. There's about 1/3 that was completed at the time of publication of the book, which was December 2022. Improvement in the road performance has been achieved, and in combination with diligent maintenance and related response to climate-related events, it's helping to assure the continued viability of the roadway and its vital contribution to the community in its present location. We also know that communities like Tuktoyaktuk that are more remote are highly dependent on these roads to be connected with other centers, and so these projects are even more important for communities that are located in the north and remote from other centers. When we spoke with Sean Stuckey, the Senior Administrative Officer for Tuktoyaktuk, he mentioned that the growing social and economic challenge faces by northern communities, a challenge which were made increasingly more difficult by the COVID-19 pandemic and the changing climate. Indigenous communities can still be successful in protecting their infrastructure against climate change, and that he recommends a 3-step approach that consists of securing funding, sourcing the right expertise, and ensuring planning that includes public engagement. All right, now we are moving, I mentioned before, but we want to ensure that we were covering issues faced by both large and smaller communities. So we are moving to the rural municipality of Turch River number 488 in Saskatchewan, who invested in the rehabilitation of the 6-mile bridge. Excuse me. So increases in winter and spring flows have been observed over the last several decades, placing bridges, but also other infrastructure at risk for flooding. Many rural bridges in Saskatchewan and across other provinces and territories are in bad structural conditions and either are or will soon be under load restrictions to avoid them collapsing or facing additional damage. So the 6 Mile Bridge in this case is a 6 meter long, 7.3 meter wide bridge, served the tributary of the Kelsey Lake situated north of Township Road 532, which channels water year round. The bridge conveyed much of the spring flow, which is expected to increase in the future under future climate conditions. And its deteriorating conditions suggested an inability to withstand future weather and climate changes, and necessitated at the time a 3-ton load restriction in 2017. One of the issues we've seen with some of these rural community is that when we start adding these load restrictions, it really restricts, especially for agricultural purposes, there's a lot of traffic on these roads and bridges. It really restricts the road that trucks can take. It makes their commute much longer, less efficient. So to be able to successfully rehabilitate these bridges makes a big difference for the communities up there. So 2 solutions were considered for the rehabilitation of the 6 Mile Bridge. The first one was to repair the timber bridge to extend its life. And the second one, which ended up being the approach that was selected, was to replace the bridge with 2 2,000 millimeter diameters culverts and to use financial resources from the rural municipality to fund the project. So the proposed size of the culvert was also aligned with the provincial climate resilience report, which recommended the minimum diameter of culverts on the provincial highway network to be 900 millimeters. The outcome is that, as I mentioned,
Sorry, Sophie, your voice, your audio is, it's been pretty good, but now it's starting to break up a little bit. So maybe you want to turn off.
Okay, I'm going to stop my video for a little bit and I'll come back at the end. So, all right. So in terms of outcome, materials and goods can now be transported safely without the risk of failing infrastructure. And because the culvert has been built with expected climate change events in mind, it's now there for a long time and ready to face some of the extreme weather conditions that may arise in the years to come. Sorry. When we spoke with Samrat Hussain, who is the engineer, one of the engineers with the rural municipality of Torch River, he mentioned that in a community, it is important to inspect all assets routinely to allow the municipality to identify a list of assets that need attention. Municipalities just cannot leave the structure out there to fight with climate without looking after them. And one way to ensure requirements for inspections and paying close attention to critical infrastructure is to include it within an asset management plan. Our final category, which is to build back better in recovery. So we have 2 more cases here, going back to the East Coast in St. John's, Newfoundland. The rehabilitation of a storm sewer to support current and future precipitations. So as obviously we've covered some of that before, but as changes in precipitation patterns impact municipal stormwater infrastructure, it becomes even more important for municipalities to plan for the rehabilitation of storm sewers in a way that accounts for future rainfall projections. So in St. John specifically, as you all know, we are talking about a coastal city that has been impacted by several post-tropical storms in the past, including post-tropical storm Gabrielle, Hurricane Igor, and other large rainfall events that resulted in urban flooding, which at the time highlighted the need to upgrade the existing sewer system. So, you know, there's many sewers that need upgrade, but the city prioritized its intervention on one of St. John's main road, which connects the city's east and west end. And it's also one of the main commercial streets due to its deterioration and lack of capacity to handle severe rainfall events. So, excuse me. When they started approaching the design of the new sewer for that road, the engineering team made it a priority to ensure its performance for future climate conditions. And they've gathered several information from different climate models, and it allowed the team to choose a design based on a return period of 25 years. And the new sewer ranges in size from 200% to 400% greater than the previous pipes that were in place, which is significantly improving the capacity on that road. So the replacement of the Kenmount Road sewer was a capital project for the city, and that was made possible with contributions for both from both the provincial and federal government. The city estimated that incorporating these future climate projections in the design would initially increase the cost by approximately 15 to 20%, but that these initial additional costs, they were not as much of a concern because they anticipated that the life cycle savings would far outweigh the additional capital costs that they chose to invest. When we spoke with Mark White, the manager of construction engineering for the city of St. John's, he mentioned that these projects take time and money to realize. Specifically in this case, it involved dealing with a lot of stores, a lot of road changes, as it was one of the main road in the city. And it is essential to understand the various risks and rehabilitation benefits associated with infrastructure replacement. There will never be a shortage of projects, and the successful completion of impactful initiative also means there are less things to worry about in the future. The final case study that I want to share today is in Edmonton, Alberta, and they incorporated climate adaptation measures into the canal bridge design. One of the reasons I thought it was an interesting case is that this infrastructure was not changed due to a specific event happening. They were going to upgrade the infrastructure nonetheless because they needed a larger bridge, and they decided at the time to make the change. So more specifically, because of population growth and the expansion of communities, they were faced with high pressures to reduce traffic. And that specific bridge in Alberta is one of the 9 roadway bridges crossing the North Saskatchewan River in the city of Edmonton. And since the bridge was originally built, Edmonton's population has more than tripled, and the traffic volume has increased considerably. So in order to alleviate traffic on the bridge, the municipal decided to undertake a rehabilitation of the bridge to include 2 additional lanes and to do it in a way that ensures structural performance over the next 50 years. So similarly to the city of Laval that we mentioned earlier, they decided to use the PIVC protocol to define, evaluate, and prioritize information and relationships around the climate change impacts that were at risk of affecting the specific bridge. And the analysis revealed that 2 infrastructure components were showing greater vulnerability for future climate risks, which were the wearing surface of the deck system and the drainage system. So they worked to address those 2 vulnerabilities in the design. And the rehabilitation of the bridge was completed 10 years ago, and there have not been any issues since. Neither has city staff identified any concern with the structure since the completion of the construction, despite some extreme weather events that have taken place since the completion of the construction. When we spoke with Mark Scanlon, who is the bridge supervisor with the city of Edmonton, he mentioned that investing in the proper rehabilitation of key municipal infrastructure can have immense environmental and financial benefits for communities. He's a strong believer that the most resilient and environmental structures are the ones in place. The more we can do to protect them, the more sustainable and less costly they will be over time. So obviously, those are about half of the case studies that we've collected. They're all available online. But we, from these 20 case studies, we took out 4 main best practices that we've noticed throughout the report. So the first one, very important, that we've seen that in all case studies in this report, that understanding infrastructure vulnerabilities to climate risk is really the first crucial step. policies, design, and construction practices for public infrastructure should always be anchored in a very strong understanding of what are the specific risks and specific vulnerabilities that are faced by either a specific asset, but also its broader infrastructure system when that's applicable. And to really start with that, to be able to not only implement the right adaptation measures, but also prioritize them over time, understand which ones are more at risk than others, and really integrate that within our second best practice, which is to create asset management plans. So asset management plans, they allow communities to establish long-term management plans that can inform decision makers on priority investments. So that can mean deciding which is the next infrastructure that you're going to rehabilitate, but also what are some of the maintenance plans that should be in place to ensure that we don't have to make large investments over time, that we can maintain our infrastructure and have them last as long as possible. Another big one, and I would say this one we saw probably in all 5 reports of the cities adapt, is that it's not, only one person in one city. Of course, there are many local champions, but it's crucial to leverage cross-sectoral collaborations. As cities work to understand their infrastructure risk and vulnerabilities and plan for their maintenance and rehabilitation, it is so important to use the right expertise and resources. In some communities, larger, that expertise can be in-house. There can be enough resources, but in other communities that can imply reaching out to other levels of government, reaching out to the private sector or other sorts of grants to really be able to get not only the expertise, but the funding in place to be able to achieve these great initiatives. And the last one that we've identified is that although it's great to have, external expertise, it's also important to grow local capacity for climate resilient planning. When increasing the local capacity to perform climate resilient infrastructure planning and maintenance is key to ensuring the performance and longevity of public infrastructure across the country. And in this context, we're not only talking about human expertise, but also financial and political resources so that climate resilience intervention become a priority in all local governments across the country. I wanted to end by sharing that this is the link to adapt the Cities Adapt report, citiesadapt.com. I also welcome any questions that you may have. Here's my email. And the 6th volume I mentioned will be looking at green infrastructure. It will be out at the end of this year. And we look forward to presenting some more of these case studies in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Yeah, good. So we had one question. We have one question so far from Peter Chipersky, who asks, and I think this was with regard to your first case study, are you familiar with the multi-point foundation system? And I don't know what that is, whether that's a structural thing or.
I'm just gonna, the first case study that would have been, sorry, I'm just trying to see. I'm not sure specifically what this refers to. I think I would need maybe a bit more specific, but if that's a question specifically for the municipality, I'm happy to connect you with. The overall goal of these reports is to provide a story. I don't know all the technical details, but I'm happy to get any information you may need from that community.
Great, thanks. And while our audience sort of digests what you said and thinks about questions. Oh, here's one. I was going to fill in with one or two of my own. An anonymous attendee says, can you talk about data challenges to measure and manage flood risk?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's where in this report, a lot of communities, I think data management, I'm not sure if the question is specifically to the performance of the infrastructure or to collect the information for future climate risk. I would say for the second part, many communities used, or at least the smaller communities, work with groups that were very familiar with that aspect. So I'm thinking about, for example, Uranos in Quebec that had their own climate models that were able to support municipalities. They were integrated within protocols like the PIVC protocols to provide that insight. So in those cases that data didn't come directly from the municipalities, and some larger municipalities that have more resources that I think came in, especially I think in the Toronto case study. But and in terms of monitoring, I remember specifically speaking with Edmonton, and for them, they didn't necessarily have specific data to monitor, but their regular inspections on infrastructure, making sure that everything was working according to plan. They had a specific division that was allocated time specifically and looking at all their bridges infrastructure, making sure that everything was working properly. So that was part of their, I guess, human resources way of collecting that information. But in terms of other specific systems, I'm not sure that I could be a lot more specific.
Well, I don't know whether our anonymous attendee has attended the PIVC training, but you mentioned PIVC, and I just want to let the questioner know that if you haven't sort of studied the PIVC protocol, it's wonderful. The training offers pointers to publicly available hazard information. The latest and the most authoritative and so on. And that, that's obviously not going to answer everyone's questions about every aspect of flood hazard or flood risk, but I find it to be very useful. I go back to it over and over again. Just having that place where they say, oh, here's where you can get information about flood and fire and so on and so forth. So anyway,
Absolutely.
Yeah. See, so I have some questions. The Finch Avenue, one of them is very particular, the Finch Avenue culvert. You said that Toronto now bases their design on the 100-year storm. Is that the 100-year storm for the present climate going forward, or is it the 100-year storm as indicated by the last 30 years of precipitation? Is that past climate or future climate that they're designing for? And why 100 years? Is that just because it's better than 50 years? Is a 100-year design to, the past 30 years of climate, like designing for the 50-year storm in the next 30 years? Is Toronto just playing catch up here?
I think definitely from what I understood from this case study is that was a big wake-up call event, that culvert specifically. But my understanding is that it is based on future climate event. I could confirm that for you. And I think it was, obviously increasing significantly from what was there before. But why that specific number, I'm not sure. I think they had to make a decision based on the information that was available. And I think they also looked at past events, but also looking at future climate projections to come up with that number. But I can find out more about that specifically.
Sort of an across the board question. Maybe all of the case studies you offered us are triggered by past events, right? By a past flood or washout of a culvert, etc. Would all of these cities have saved? This is going to be a long question because it's kind of a rambling thought in my head. Would all of those cities have saved money by doing this stuff before the disaster rather than after? I mean, was it predictable that these horses would get out of the barn and they should close the barn door before the horse got out, or could they have reasonably anticipated these needs before the disaster? Could they have reasonably selected these mitigation measures before suffering a loss? Or would they, have, if they'd just been thinking about all future climate related problems with their infrastructure, would they have overspent or not known where to spend the money or whatever? What I'm getting at is, can we reasonably tell cities to adapt before the disaster?
I think that's a really important question. I think also I've talked to you about one report, but across the 5 reports, I would say 4 of them, most of the case studies were reactive. One of them was more proactive. It was the one on heat help. It was in part across levels of government. So it was a slightly different approach. But going back to your question, I think this, yes, I think a lot of these things can be avoided. I think municipalities, I've mentioned this in the past, 60% of Canada's public infrastructure is owned by municipality. A lot of it has been degrading over time, and a lot of it was planned with the previous construction standards. So that leaves municipality with an incredible amount of work. And most importantly, I believe an incredible amount of planning and preparation to identify where to invest first. So in the municipality, yeah, you would have the Finch Avenue culverts, but you have many other culverts, right? So which one do you start with? And I think this goes back to the importance, and this came out a lot in this report, of understanding your risk. Like you will invest money to do that, but this will save you many headaches in the future. It will allow you to, in some cases, you may not need to repair this infrastructure. You may just need to have a stronger asset management plan, a stronger maintenance plan in place, but to be able to use tools like PIVC or other approaches that were developed in-house by cities, and understanding what are your assets, what are either independent items of these asset systems or the system at all that are most at risk. And maybe you will still have some of your, least prioritized infrastructure affected, but at least you'll have done the work, and your high risk, you can check them off the list first, right? So yes, of course, many municipalities that could have been avoided, but I think given the incredible amount of infrastructure they've inherited that is no longer necessarily adapted, they have such an incredible amount of work that, is it all avoidable? Probably not. But certainly as communities spend more time understanding risk and creating asset management plans, that risk can be significantly reduced, is really what, came out of this report.
And is the maintenance, you mentioned clearing, I think you mentioned clearing culverts, or maybe I just thought of clearing culverts. What are the big maintenance lessons that you learn here, that you've learned from Cities Adapted, in addition to, making sure your culverts don't get all blocked up between storms?
Yeah, big maintenance. We covered so many different types of infrastructure. I think, yeah, culverts being blocked up is one of them. I would have to think. I'm thinking just right now, top of mind, that bridge in Saskatchewan. There's many rural bridges that instead of doing maintenance or repair, they just end up reducing the load that can travel on them. So I think, being able to address maybe some of these repairs earlier could help not getting to that point that early in the process, so that if you can kind of see how it progresses over time, evaluate what the structure looks like more frequently, then you can come at a place where you don't have to just say you can no longer drive on this bridge, and you can kind of, extend that lifespan a little bit. So I think that would be an example. Yeah, there's many. I would have to think specifically for each, but I think that's the top example that comes to mind.
What would that community, what would the bridge maintenance have looked like? Does that mean like patching places where the concrete spalls over rebar, or what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that means for specific bridges, but I think just being aware of the state of degradation and having frequent structural inspections, maybe more frequent, could have helped in general.
Okay, thanks. Another sort of across the board question. You said early on that a lot of this infrastructure, and you said a couple of times, a lot of the infrastructure was designed a long time ago, which meant to me lower standards, designed to the past climate, not the present climate, and designed for the population that they had at the time. Right? You mentioned Edmonton, where the population has grown by, I think it was Edmonton, where the population has grown by a factor of 3. Now, I'm an engineer and a bit of a scold to the engineering community when it comes to design criteria, both for future growth and for future climate. Like in the United States, there are national regulations that say you can't design your highway infrastructure for beyond 20 years from now, which is, crazy, because the infrastructure is going to last 100 years or more. Anyway, so are the problems, how many of the problems that you've encountered with Cities Adapt how many of these problems are caused by deficient engineering design? To what extent are cities adapting to bad choices that my colleagues have made? Bad leadership by the authors of design guidelines, or maybe to put it more positively, how should design requirements change to better balance costs, community costs and future losses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, this report looks specifically at infrastructure, but we have other reports that look more at buildings as well. And I think that we've seen across the board is that, when we build buildings infrastructure, you just said it yourself, it lasts for a long time. With the construction code 50 years ago, it certainly didn't have the knowledge that we have today. And so I think that engineers make mistakes. They built, according to the code that they had and according to historical events that they knew of that have changed dramatically, right? In this past 50 years or so more. But so to what extent it is their fault? Excuse me. I would be tempted to say that they worked with the knowledge they had at the time. They worked with the knowledge that was, that was, I'm looking for my words, but that was accepted as best design at the time. And we've seen that, we see that with the building code as well, right? These are discussions that we've had internally at ICLR and externally about the building code being designed to keep people safe, but not necessarily being designed for to increase the performance of buildings or the resilience under severe weather events over time. So we've seen that a lot with Cities Adapt as well. And I think, did the architects, engineers do a bad job? Not necessarily, because they were, they were responding to what the purpose of the building code at the time was, but that purpose has changed and evolved. And I think, there are many discussions right now at the national level, at the provincial levels to make changes in these codes and construction practices. And hopefully that same thinking, still grows with infrastructure design. And we have seen it increasingly. And infrastructure design can also mean infrastructure rehabilitation, right? So you don't have to rebuild the whole thing always to enhance performance. So that was also a big learning of that report.
Thank you for letting the engineering community off the hook, at least the ones at 50 years ago. I'm not so ready to do that. It's one thing to have a code and design requirements and meet it. You can do that, and the designer is blameless. They've done what they're supposed to do. But that's not the same thing as knowing that the knowledge at the time gave us the best design requirements at the time.
Yeah.
Right? The design requirements could have been predictably deficient 50 years ago. We like to pretend that our problems today with our existing infrastructures, because those people 50 years, a generation, 2 generations ago, didn't know what we know now. But now we know everything, and and now new infrastructure is designed to be great. But 50 years ago, they might have said the exact same thing. And what that tells me today is we may know better
More
now,
yeah,
about how we should be designing now, and still be under designing, right? So we have a code, we might have design requirements that one can predictably say are insufficient today. And I think that we could have said the same thing a generation or two ago. So anyway, that's soapbox stuff, not an actual question. We don't actually have other questions in the Q&A. We don't have to go to the end of the hour. Is there anything else you want to tell us about? Any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
No, well, of course, I think, each community has its own specific, had its own specific challenges and its own specific initiatives. So if there are any aspects that I didn't cover, or that you have any technical questions, please do feel free to reach out, and I will do my best to get that information from you. This, report is really, designed to provide the story in about 1,000 words per story, so we don't get the chance to go into all the technicalities, but I know some of you may be interested in that. So if you would like to be, placed in contact with some of the municipal people that we worked with, if you would like to learn more about any communities or any of the other reports, please feel free to reach out. And we're looking forward to share the 6th one in the coming months as well.
Thank you so much, Sophie. This is a wonderful series of documents, very useful, and I hope that we can get them into the hands of the people who could get the most value from them. Let's see. Before we sign off, I want to remind our audience of our next few speakers. Some things to look forward to in May. I told you already that Janelle Maffei and Cheryl Rabinovici of the California Earthquake Authority are going to talk about seismic retrofit for wood frame houses. In June, Julius Gambos is going to give his talk on nature-based flood protection for Toronto's waterfront. This was a Friday forum that we tried but failed to have because of an emergency in December, I think it was. And in July 14th, doctors Louise Arnault and Alain Pietroniro are going to talk about a flood forecasting framework for Canada. So stay tuned to your email inboxes, and please consider joining us for those future Friday fora. Sophie's slides and video will be posted sometime this weekend to ICLR's webpage. Thank you all for attending today. Thanks again, Sophie, for a great talk, and for particularly for the fabulous work that you're doing on Cities Adapt. It's a real privilege to be affiliated with an organization that's producing those wonderful reports. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.